Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Kharkiv direction, where the Russians continue advancing, moving the forces further to the south in direction of Kharkiv. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, during the previous 24 hours the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Glubokaya, and the Russians captured the village by the name of Volchansk. Furthermore, according to reports we received, the Russians managed to bypass the fields and to enter the residential area to the north of Lyptsi. So this is already Lyptsi, it's like a part of Lyptsi, and now the Russians are moving further to the south. When talking about different mappers, they have already adjusted their maps showing additional Russian progress, and this is like approximately the territories that were captured by the Russians by the, let's say, evening of the 15th of May. Yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, but most likely this is something that took place and happened today on this direction. So as we can see, the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, we got reports from the Ukrainian sources that that there is just one brigade, 42nd Mechanized Brigade, who's responsible for Lyptsi direction, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians are not planning to send additional reinforcements to the north. And the main purpose of this 42nd Mechanized Brigade is to hold the Russians as long as possible, but anyway, sooner or later they will be defeated, and when they defeated, they would move back to the south in direction of towns like Tsirkuny, let's say Cherkassky Tishki, Ruski Tishki, Mamotova, and Alexandrovka, because according to reports, let's say, of the 79th separate air assault brigade, whose squads and, let's say, forces and some battalions were deployed to Kharkiv, according to them, they have a report that they have an order that nobody is going to be sent to the borderlands. So the main clashes and the main battle the Ukrainians are planning to give the Russians around Kharkiv, not outside of Kharkiv but around. So the Ukrainians are trying and planning to repeat the same story as they used to have in the 2022, when the Russians have almost reached Kharkiv, when some Russian squads even managed to cross the ring road, but then the Russians were defeated because the Ukrainians were using artillery from inside of, let's say, town. They had possibilities to hide their equipment between the buildings, and that of course gave the Ukrainians significant benefits. But there is one important difference in comparison with the 2022, because in 2022 the Russians didn't have a lot of reconnaissance equipment. They have maybe a few drones. The Russians didn't have enough of satellite forces. The Russians didn't have enough of drones, but now the Russians have maybe 5 times more of intelligence equipment that allows them to see Kharkiv 24 hours, 7 days a week. For example, just during the first days of clashes on Kharkiv direction, the Russians destroyed at least 2 multiple launch rocket systems, let's say in the area in the borders of Kharkiv itself. So this is the area where the first multiple launch rocket system was destroyed. This is the second one. So the Russians control everything and they see everything, and it's not very smart, as I understand, to rely on the same tactics and the same things that used to be in 2022 now in 2024. The Russians have prepared themselves for this offensive. The question is whether the Ukrainians prepared themselves for the same offensive as well. Anyway, when talking about the, let's say, the icons, as you can see, we have significant number of icons: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 icons, 9 icons of Lancet strikes on Ukrainian positions, on the Ukrainian artillery positions, on Ukrainian tank forces. So just from the period from 10 till 12th of May, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of Ukrainian artillery forces, tank equipment, armored vehicles, personnel carriers, and many other equipment that Ukrainians were using for protection of the territory. So we see complete superiority, and we see no resistance from the Ukrainian side. We have no geolocations, no videos of Ukrainian FPV drone strikes, let's say in Pylna, Borisovka, Markovets. Just there were a few videos before, but now we have nothing. And the question is, why is that? There are few options. The Ukrainians basically don't have enough of equipment on this direction, or the second reason is that the Russians managed to significantly improve their electronic warfare equipment, and now the Ukrainians basically can't pass this dome. So they are, let's say, the Russians managed to jam everything that flies, let's say, above the soldiers or something like this. Anyway, sooner or later we're gonna find this out, and then everything is going to be clear to us. Anyway, the Russians, as we discussed in the previous updates, control the main hills. This is the area of the main hill in the direction 200.22, as I remember, meters, and from this area the Russians can see everything, and this allows them to move further and further without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Yet we haven't received any confirmations of Russian control over Zelyone. The Russians continue bombing the territory, so most likely there are still Ukrainians, or the Russians don't see any value from this direction. For now they're trying to use the forces in one direction, Lyptsi, and they don't want to stretch their reinforcements and reserves along the entire line of combat contact. Now let's move to Volchansk. I believe that this is the most interesting direction, because today a lot of sources reported that the Russians captured Volchansk completely. Most of them, let's say, were just speculations and wishful thinkings, but according to the freshest update, the Russians maybe have just established control over the northern part, over the part that located on the northern side of Volcha River. We have a lot of, let's say, confirmations of that. We have the Ukrainians who were making their statements on the southern part of, let's say, Volcha River, saying that the situation is critical, and we haven't received even a single video from the Ukrainian side from the northern part. Just the videos of the Russian troopers who are wave by wave is heading towards the northern part of Volchansk and forcing the Ukrainians to fall back. Very interesting videos we received from these areas. You can see two icons. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing the main bridge that Ukrainians were using for evacuation. They used to use this bridge for, let's say, supply and support. Now they can use the bridge just for evacuation. And this is the same area, just a little bit, let's say, to the east from the bridge. The Russians were also bombing this territory, and as I understand, the Russians established complete fire control over the main evacuation roads. The Ukrainians are running away from the northern part, and the Russians are trying to destroy them, as many as possible, during this process. But anyway, regarding the reports, regarding the situation, we're not going to adjust the map right now. We believe that the northern part is in the gray zone, but most likely by tomorrow morning or maybe this evening, the Russians will give us the first report about complete control, and soon, maybe in a few next hours, we're gonna start receiving the first videos with the Russian flags in the northern part, most likely. The fog of war was, let's say, removed from the village by the name of Tikha. On this video we can see how the Russians were bombing this territory with 12 flamethrower systems. If you remember, during the previous few days we got reports that the Russians captured this territory, but now we have confirmations that most likely there are still Ukrainians. So this is the situation in Volchansk direction. Now let's move a little bit to the west. The sources reported that the Russians captured completely the village by the name of Bugrovatka. We got this report yesterday, and today we got confirmation that the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Staritsa. We have few geolocations, but most of them are, let's say, very close along Sadova Street, as close as possible to Bugrovatka. We still haven't received any geolocations from the central part, so for now we're going to keep the area as a gray zone, but once again, most likely this territory was also captured. The question is what the Russians are going to do next, whether the Russians are going to move further to the south, trying to bypass or break through the forest, which is going to be very difficult and it will take a lot of time, or the Russians will try to attack the Ukrainians on the line between Ternova, Bayrak, Zamulovka and Verkhny Saltov. So for the Russians, according to let's say, the energy they are going to spend on the taking control of the territory, this line is much more better and much more easier way to capture control over the territory than to move through the forest, because forest is always a problem for the Russians, and this have been the problem for the Russians since the beginning of the special military operation. I don't remember even a single battle for the forest where the Russians won, let's say, with, let's say, very easy. Everything was always very difficult. In Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Kremenaya forest, in the vicinity of Slavyansk. So for the Russians, of course, it's better to bypass this area somehow from the east and moving to the south west. Now we are moving further to the line of combat contact to other directions, and let's start from the Kupiansk area. According to information we have, at least we got reports that the Russians entered Berestova. For now we can't confirm this information. There were a few sources who reported that. For now we are going to keep the area as a territory under Ukraine control, but anyway we start receiving some updates, and we have no doubts that sooner or later this is going to happen, because during the previous days the Russians were moving towards Stelmakhovka, trying to improve their positions along the tree line in front of the village. And we got a few more geolocations of how the Russians were FPV droning the village itself, trying to prepare the foothold for further offensive operation. We haven't received anything from the south in Kupiansk direction. Few updates from Siversk direction. Today was a very, let's say, rich day for the Russians. They managed to destroy a significant number of Ukrainian artillery systems as a result of counter-artillery duels. So we can't say what is this, the preparation before further offensive, or just a regular military activity on this direction, on this area. Chasiv Yar, lots of very interesting details and reports. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. Now we show that entire Bogdanovka is under complete Russian control, including the farms that are located to the west of the village. The Russians somehow managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, and the Russian squads, Russian groups were discovered on the outskirts of the village by the name of Kalinovka. So Kalina, on this video we can see the Russian infantry who was running from one tree to another from between brushes, trying to dodge the Ukrainian FPV drone strikes. This video and this post was published yesterday in the evening, so most likely the Russians managed to concentrate the critical mass and to enter Kalinova itself. If it's true, then this is going to be complete collapse of Ukrainians, not just in this area but also in the eastern Chasiv Yar. When talking about eastern Chasiv Yar itself, today very reliable pro-Russian resources stated that the eastern Chasiv Yar was operationally encircled. Other sources reported that it's not just operational encirclement, it's already a cauldron. So according to some sources, mainly pro-Russian sources, the eastern Chasiv Yar was encircled by the Russians completely, and the Ukrainian soldiers who are currently located in this area are no longer available to evacuate. Of course, this is operational encirclement because the Russians don't have their positions right behind Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. The Russians managed to get as close as possible from the north. The Russians managed to get as close as possible from the south, but the Ukrainians still have probably possibility to cross canal during the night period of time, but the losses are very heavy because the Russian FPV drones flying this area, above this area 24 hours, 7 days a week. So the situation is very critical. Klishchievka, according to geolocations we received, the Russians most likely managed to improve their positions in the village and to capture the territory around church, because the main Russian strikes took place further to the west on the hill and on the western part of Klishchievka and on the southwestern part in this territory. All these things confirms that the Russians are moving focus further to the west, and most likely the Ukrainians are about to abandon Klishchievka as well and to move further on the Ukrainian side of canal towards the towns, the villages like Delivka and Bilagora. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. We got very interesting details. After the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Solovyova, Acheretina, after the Russians have almost entered the first buildings and the first streets of the village by the name of Novoalexandrovka, after the Russians captured Arkhangelska and Keramik with Novokalinova, the Russians stopped. And during the previous few weeks we haven't received even a single update about the Russian attempts to attack further to the west. After the Russians started Kharkiv offensive operation, we see complete, let's say, reduce of any activity from the Russian side. And furthermore, today, on the 15th of May, we start receiving first updates from the Ukrainian side about Ukrainian attempts to counterattack the Russian forces. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians between Acheretina and Solovyova, trying to improve their positions and to restore their connections with the mainland. Currently, we can't tell for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to achieve some results or not, but according to, let's say, sources on the ground, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over some 3 lines between Solovyova and Sokol. For now, we don't have any geolocations. We can't improve this information or not confirm or not confirm this information. But this is the situation. The Ukrainians start counterattacks. You know that I believe that the Russians will continue staying in defense in Acheretina. They did everything they could during the previous weeks of clashes. They captured significant significant number of towns. They managed to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Most likely the next few months, while the battle for Chasiv Yar and battle on Kharkiv, the Russians on Avdiivka will be in operational post, trying to restore their positions, trying to get some rest and so on. Of course, until the let's say final stabilization of the front line, the Russians would try to get the last villages on the direction. I'm talking about Yasnobrodovka, Netailo, Volmanskaya. So this territory probably will be captured by the Russians completely during this stage of the special military operation, but after that the Russians will start, let's say, some pause. They will have some pause. They need some pause because the battle for Avdiivka started in October of 2023, and since that morning we have been seeing the battle almost every single day. The Russian forces are exhausted and they need some pause. They need some, let's say, a few weeks of holidays or something like this, and this is exactly what they're going to see there. Of course, the Russians will finish the battle for Krasnogorovka, but we see that we're receiving less and less updates from the town. We can't tell for sure what exactly is happening there. Most likely the Ukrainians currently concentrated main forces in the western and the northwestern directions of the village, which is good for the Russians because from the high-rise buildings and from the industrial zone the Russians see everything. And as I understand, there is just a regular military routine with FPV drone strikes, with the hunting on Ukrainian forces, and the Russians just try to force the Ukrainians to fall back, but without any attempts to attack the Ukrainians on the ground. Pobeda area, the second day in a row or third day in a row, we continue receiving updates about attempts from the Ukrainian side to counterattack the Russians there. Another attempt to attack, another batch of Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed, another batch of Ukrainian soldiers were also destroyed during those attempts. So this is very interesting because regarding and despite the complete initiative in the Russian hands, the Ukrainians at some directions try to counterattack. Очередина, now Pobeda, because they understand that this is the vital question for them, because without Pobeda for the Russians it's going to be very difficult to attack Konstantinovka. But despite all these attempts, the Russians continue attack towards Paraskovivka, and today we got reports that the Russians entered and the forces of 79th Brigade, who is responsible for protection of this direction, stated that most likely the Russians are about to finish the clearing of Paraskovivka, and then the battle for Konstantinovka is going to start. Maybe this is the reason of Ukraine counterattacks. They tried to improve their positions before the beginning of the battle for Konstantinovka. Very interesting details are coming from Urazhayna Staromayorskaya area. The Russians entered Staromayorsk, and according to information we have, they managed to establish complete control over the southern part. They captured the library, the local library, the House of Culture, maybe the town hall. And when talking about the Urazhayna, we see significant number of geolocations with artillery strike, aviation strikes. Furthermore, as you can see, we have adjusted the map because we also had the video of Russian breakthrough in the direction of how the Russian armored vehicle reached almost the intersections of the Central Street and the 0518 road. For now, we don't have 100% proofs that the Russians managed to stabilize the front line and digging deeper here, but anyway we have the proofs to color the territory as a gray zone. So the Russians are moving on this direction as well, and most likely during the next few months we're going to see lots of clashes, and most likely the Russians will be able to restore control over Staromayorsk and Urazhayna as well, and to move the Ukrainian forces to the north of this red line. And of course this is going to be significant progress from the Russian side. I'm not sure whether the Russians are going to move further to the west. Everything depends on the, let's say, battle for Ugledar, Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka, Vodyana. If the Russians can capture these towns, of course, then they will move further to Novelika, Novoselovka. Robotyne. Today, the Russians, Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Robotyne. And basically, the Russians managed to reduce till zero the Ukrainian progress and Ukrainian achievements during the greatest Ukrainian counter-offensive. Now the village is under complete Russian control. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back to the fields. The Russians start hunting the Ukrainians between the fields, and maybe the Ukrainians will show some resistance during the next few months due to the summer and spring and, let's say, green leaves and green grass, which allows them to stay invisible for a very long time. But probably before autumn comes or during the early autumn, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back to Orekhov as well. So the Russians most likely will will restore control over every single fortification and every single square meter they lost during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive. Kherson, we have nothing special, just a regular activity. Ukraine FPV drone strikes on Russian positions. We have adjusted the map. Now there is no Ukrainian presence because we have a lot of FPV drones attack on the Russian soldiers, which confirms that the Ukrainians don't control Krynki anymore. Maybe some sabotage groups can enter, but that's it. We made some changes on the map as well. We have replaced the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. I remind you that yesterday it used to be Shoigu, now it's Andrei Belousov, the current Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. He is economist, and according to Putin, his main purpose is to make economy economical, to reduce expenses, to optimize the costs, to do everything to, let's say, handle with the special military operation with the current budget. As I understand, based on Putin, the budget for special military operation is growing and growing very fast. So that's why the Russians are trying to find the inner reserves, how to reduce the costs, how to remove everything unnecessary, because since the beginning of the special military operation, there are a lot of unnecessary things, very big corruption as well as in Ukraine, less than Ukraine, but when talking about money, maybe even more. So that's why the Russians are planning to optimize everything and to find additional financial resources for the special military operation. As we discussed today, the United States of America launched, let's say, ballistic Blinken missile, and as a result of ballistic Blinken missile strike, the Ukrainian pubs and bars were destroyed by him, by rock star songs and so on. So everything is cool in Blinken world and so on, but probably after such a big and funny party, he realized everything, and he promised Ukraine additional Patriot systems. He promised Ukraine additional $2 billion, and he promised a lot to Ukraine, and most likely very soon we're gonna see the Patriot system in the area of Kharkiv. It's very important for the Ukrainians because without air defense they will not be able to hold the area very long. Very interesting updates are coming from Europe. Today the Piotr Pavel, the president of Czech Republic, stated that it's time to start negotiation. It is necessary to stop the war and to start discussing the future post-war system. He says that we must be realistic. The parties to the conflict during the negotiations after the ceasing of the hostiles must reach a compromise to settle the situation. There must be a compromise, and according to him, most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to return the territory until the borders of 1991. I remind you that Piotr Pavel is one of those, let's say, hawks in Europe who was for fighting with Russia till the last, not Ukraine, but probably European civilian. We have updates from Slovakia. One of the allies of Russian Federation, the Prime Minister Robert Fico, was assassinated by somebody in this country, and this is of course terrible situation. Hope that everything is going to fine with this person. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.